The morning of October 14th, 1066, broke cold and gray over the ridge of Senlac Hill, a few miles north of the coastal town of Hastings. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the collective breath of thousands of men shivering in the autumn chill. On this narrow strip of ground, two distinct worlds were about to collide in a struggle that would terminate one era of history and violently birth another. To the men standing on the ridge, this was not a textbook entry or a legendary tale. It was a desperate fight for survival, land, and the right to rule a kingdom that had suddenly found itself without a master. The tragedy of this day truly began 9 months earlier, in the quiet chambers of Westminster, with the death of King Edward the Confessor. Edward had lived a life of piety, but his failure to produce an heir left the English throne vacant and the kingdom in peril. 3 men immediately reached for the crown, each believing he had the sole right to wear it. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, claimed the dying king had named him successor. Across the English Channel, William, the Duke of Normandy, insisted that Edward, his distant cousin, had promised him the throne years before in exchange for protection. Meanwhile, from the frozen fjords of the north, the legendary Viking king Harold Godwinson prepared his dragon ships, convinced that England belonged to the heirs of the great Scandinavian empires. England became the center of a geopolitical storm. While Harold Godwinson was crowned in London, the winds of war were gathering on 2 fronts. The first blow fell in the north, where the Vikings landed with a terrifying force. In an incredible display of leadership and endurance, Harold marched his army nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, catching the Vikings by surprise at Stamford Bridge. It was a bloodbath that effectively ended the Viking Age in England, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Harold's men were exhausted, their ranks thinned, and their spirits weary. Yet, at the very moment they were celebrating their triumph, the wind shifted in the south. William of Normandy had finally crossed the Channel and landed his forces on the Sussex coast. With no time to rest or recruit fresh troops, Harold turned his battered army around and marched them all the way back across the length of the country. By the time they reached the heights above Hastings, they were a force of shadows, brave, but physically spent. They took their positions at the top of a steep slope, forming a dense, interlocking wall of shields. This was the legendary shield wall of the Anglo-Saxons, a formation so tight and disciplined that it was said a thrown spear could not pass between the warriors. The front ranks were held by the housecarls, the king's elite guard, armed with massive 2-handed Danish axes capable of splitting a man from shoulder to waist with a single blow. Below them, in the valley, stood the Norman war machine. Unlike the purely infantry-based English, William had brought a diverse force of archers, heavy infantry, and, most importantly, the finest cavalry in Europe. His knights were a new breed of warrior, riding powerful destriers and using a revolutionary technique of charging with a couched lance to deliver a devastating impact. For hours, the battle was a gruesome stalemate. The Norman archers fired clouds of arrows uphill, but they either rattled harmlessly off the English shields or sailed over the heads of the defenders. The Norman infantry and cavalry tried to charge up the muddy slope, but they were met with a rain of stones, javelins, and the terrifying swing of those great axes. The English held their ground with grim determination, and for half the day, it looked as though William's gamble would end in his death. Then came the 20 minutes that changed the course of Western history. Around midday, a wave of panic swept through the Breton troops on William's left flank. A rumor spread like wildfire through the ranks. The Duke was dead. Believing their leader had fallen, the Bretons broke formation and fled down the hill in terror. Seeing the enemy's backs for the first time, the English peasant militia on the right flank could not contain their excitement. Despite Harold's strict and repeated orders to never break the shield wall, hundreds of English soldiers surged forward, screaming in triumph as they chased the fleeing Bretons into the valley. In that short window of time, the discipline that had protected England for centuries vanished. William, who was very much alive, saw the disaster unfolding and realized it was his only chance. He spurred his horse forward, tore off his helmet so his men could see his face, and shouted that he lived and that with God's help, he would still conquer. He rallied his knights and turned them back toward the English who had foolishly left the safety of the ridge. Caught on the open ground without the protection of the shield wall, the English infantry were slaughtered where they stood. More importantly, the great wall on the hill now had a gaping hole. The iron line was broken, and it could never be fully repaired. William, realizing that the English could be tempted by their own aggression, ordered his troops to perform several more feigned retreats throughout the afternoon. Each time, more English soldiers broke rank to pursue, and each time, they were cut down by the Norman cavalry. The shield wall grew thinner and thinner as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. In a final, desperate attempt to break the resistance, William ordered his archers to change their aim. Instead of firing directly at the shields, they aimed high into the air so that the arrows would fall vertically onto the heads of the defenders. It was during this final barrage that King Harold was struck. Though history debates the exact nature of his death, the tradition holds that an arrow pierced his eye, blinding and mortally wounding him. As their king fell, the heart went out of the English army. A group of Norman knights hacked their way through the remaining housecarls and finished the job, brutally slaying Harold on the very spot where his standard had flown. The housecarls, true to their oath, fought to the last man around the body of their fallen lord, but the rest of the army dissolved into the dark woods of the Weald. The consequences of those 20 minutes of chaos were seismic. The Norman conquest did not just bring a new king, it brought a total transformation of the English soul. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was almost entirely wiped out, replaced by a French-speaking aristocracy that viewed the native population as a conquered race. This cultural collision created the modern English language, as the Germanic tongue of the peasants merged over centuries with the elegant French of the court. We see this today in the very words we use for food, where the animal in the field has a Germanic name like cow or pig, but the meat on the table has a French name like beef or pork. To secure his new kingdom, William transformed the landscape of England with stone and mortar. He began a massive program of castle building, including the formidable White Tower of London, to serve as both a palace and a prison for a rebellious people. He commissioned the Domesday Book, a terrifyingly detailed survey of every cow, acre, and person in the land, ensuring that no penny of tax escaped his grasp. The conquest turned England away from the Viking world of the North Sea and tethered it forever to the politics and culture of Continental Europe. The Battle of Hastings serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile the thread of history truly is. If the English had maintained their discipline for just one more hour, if they had ignored the urge to chase a fleeing enemy, the sun might have set on a Norman defeat. William had no supplies, no reinforcements, and no way home. A few minutes of impulsive action by a few hundred soldiers turned a certain victory into a total collapse. In the end, the destiny of millions was decided not by grand strategies or long-term trends, but by a single moment of panic, a removed helmet, and a gap in a wall of shields.